Did GPS jamming actually cause a plane crash in the United States earlier this year? GPS jamming is one of the biggest emerging threats facing aviation today, which is why it's a topic we've discussed in a lot of videos here on the channel. There's many areas around the world where aircraft are increasingly encountering interference that can disrupt navigation systems, increase cockpit workload, and remove important layers of safety. It's an issue we keep coming back to because we think it deserves serious attention. So, when a Medivac aircraft crashed into a mountain in New Mexico after reporting a loss of GPS during a US military GPS jamming exercise, well, the headlines almost wrote themselves, with one prominent article even suggesting that this military GPS jamming was effectively causal to the accident. But anyone who actually goes through the NTSB preliminary report should be able to see that that's not what the evidence really says. And frankly, we think that most of the media is getting this crash completely wrong. And it's not just me and the rest of the Mentor team that think so. The NTSB also seem to agree, and they're keen for everyone to know. On the 5th of August, the NTSB posted a message on their social media mentioning this event and making it clear that the investigation is still ongoing and that a probable cause has still not been determined. And then they added, "We encourage members of the media covering accidents under NTSB investigation to contact the agency with questions about the process or status of an investigation to help ensure accurate reporting." The NTSB didn't single out a particular news media, but that's a pretty strong hint. Now, I want to be clear here that GPS jamming definitely was part of the story, but it appears to have been just one link in a much longer chain of events. The military did not just suddenly decide to conduct a reckless experiment. The pilots were not just suddenly left without any form of navigation, and there are several critical questions about the airport they were flying to, the approach that they flew, and even the aircraft's terrain warning systems that the media outlets could be asking about but aren't. So today, let's start with what we actually know about this tragic accident. On the night of Wednesday, May the 13th, 2026, a Beechcraft King Air C-90 operated by Generations Jets was about to depart from Roswell, New Mexico about 10 minutes before midnight on a routine air ambulance mission. On board the aircraft were 2 pilots and 2 flight nurses. They were headed to Sierra Blanca Regional Airport, which is a few miles away from the town of Ruidoso. The purpose of this flight was to pick up a patient from Sierra Blanca Airport and transport them to Albuquerque. Like I said, a routine air ambulance mission, but conducted over quite rural and mountainous terrain. And although the weather conditions that night were excellent, the flight was taking place under circumstances that can often be quite deceptive. It was a completely moonless night, the skies were clear, and the route crossed sparsely populated mountainous terrain that would have been devoid of almost all visual references when this crew looked out the window. Conditions like these meant that maintaining good spatial awareness would be all but impossible visually, so it made sense that this flight would be conducted under IFR, or Instrument Flight Rules, with an assigned altitude of 12,000 feet. And note here that this altitude isn't as high as it might first seem. Roswell, the departure airport, has an elevation of almost 3,700 feet above sea level, and the destination airport, Sierra Blanca, is at 6,800 feet, with plenty of even higher terrain in the area, especially north of the airport. So flying at 12,000 feet above sea level would put the aircraft at a height of 5,200 feet above Sierra Blanca. Anyway, the flight took off at 23:52 local time using runway 21 in Roswell. But just a few minutes after takeoff, at around midnight local time, the controller at Albuquerque Air Route Traffic Control Center, or ARTCC, contacted the flight to let them know that they'd actually climbed to 13,000 feet, 1,000 feet above their assigned altitude. That's when the crew informed the controller that they'd lost GPS navigation, adding that they were now correcting their altitude. And they also said that they would need vectors to get to their destination. As I said earlier, an unspecified US military unit was conducting a GPS jamming exercise that night, and several other aircraft would report similar problems over the following minutes. The NTSB noted that nearly 2 minutes before this exchange between the pilots and air traffic control, ADSB data for the flight that had been recorded every 2 to 3 seconds started getting recorded about once a minute and then stopped completely. Now that's the same ADSB data that we see in websites like Flight Radar 24. However, the NTSB did manage to get satellite positioning data for the portion of the flight that was jammed, because it was recorded by a separate system on the aircraft called SpiderTrack, which uses low-flying Iridium satellites. Now, a really key point here is that this GPS jamming happened after the military had notified the FAA about it, and a NOTAM was published accordingly. This NOTAM explained that this GPS jamming would be centered around a set of coordinates a few miles north of White Sands missile range, and around 90 miles west of where this flight started. According to the NTSB report, the pilots of this flight used an app called 4Flight to review and brief for their flight that evening, and that NOTAM on GPS jamming was part of that briefing package. So, after the King Air's pilots requested radar headings from ATC, the controller asked them which approach they intended to use to land at their destination. The crew initially asked to fly the airport's RNAV approach onto runway 24, and that approach is probably what this crew had initially planned for. But it wouldn't work because this is a GPS-based approach. And sure enough, a minute or two later, the crew requested the only other option for an approach onto runway 24 at Sierra Blanca, which is a conventional ILS approach. Now, at this point, nothing about the flight suggested that an accident was inevitable. Air traffic control began vectoring the King Air towards the ILS while simultaneously handling several other aircraft that were also experiencing GPS disruptions. And not only that, the Albuquerque controllers were in contact with the military, so they requested for the GPS jamming to be temporarily suspended while they worked the problem. And the military did respond. They suspended the jamming about 7 minutes after the King Air crew had reported that they'd lost their GPS. And that's where this story could have ended. But sadly, it didn't. And we'll see why after this. One of the biggest challenges when researching these videos is keeping track of information. One missing detail can completely change the story I'm trying to tell. Between technical reports, expert interviews, and ideas that pop into my head throughout the day, it's really easy for something important to get lost. And that's why I've started using the Claude Note Pro. It's an AI note taker that became part of my research workflow. Whether I'm researching an accident or planning a new video, just press record once and let Claude capture everything. If something stands out, I simply press the button again to highlight it, making it easy to find later. The built-in display lets me check the recording status and battery without having to open the app. And later, Claude turns everything into a transcript using one of its 10,000 plus templates, complete with my highlights, a summary, a mind map, and even a to-do list. I also use the Ask Claude feature all the time. If I remember discussing something but can't quite recall the details, I just ask it. It searches my recordings, finds the answer in seconds, and shows exactly where it came from. And everything syncs seamlessly across my phone and desktop, and there's up to 50 hours of recording on a single charge, and Claude complies with GDPR, ISO, and HIPAA standards. But just remember to always get people's consent before recording. So if you'd like to spend less time taking notes and more time focusing on the conversation, scan this QR code or use the link below. Just remember to use my code MENTOR10 for 10% off, and remember there's also a 30-day free return policy. Huge thanks to Claude for sponsoring the video. Now, let's get back to the story. So, the King Air pilots had requested an ILS approach to runway 24 at Sierra Blanca and had been vectored by air traffic control who could see them on radar. And then the military jamming stopped, so they and all the other pilots in the area could use their GPS and go on their way. But then, everything changed. Before getting established on the instrument approach and roughly 31 miles northeast of the airport, the crew reported that they had a visual on Ruidoso and requested a visual approach. Air traffic control approved the request, but shortly afterwards, the controllers also informed the military that the aircraft was now visual and that they could resume jamming. Meanwhile, the aircraft turned southwest towards the airport and began descending. And just a few minutes later, it struck the slopes of the Capitan Mountains, killing everyone on board. Those are the facts that we know today. Everything beyond that, why the crew elected to go visual, what they actually had in sight, whether GPS interference affected other onboard systems, and exactly how each layer of safety broke down is still very much under investigation. And that's where the media narrative being pushed by some begins to diverge from the evidence. Based on that sequence of events, it's easy to understand why this accident generated headlines. A medevac aircraft loses GPS during a military jamming exercise and then crashes into a mountain just minutes later. On the surface, it sounds almost like a straightforward cause and effect relationship. And the reason that the story returned to the news in the summer is because of a widely circulated article recently went even further, arguing that the military's GPS jamming had effectively caused the accident by leaving the pilots unable to navigate using modern systems and forcing them to rely on older techniques that they had rarely used. It's certainly a compelling story, but the problem is that that isn't actually what the preliminary report says. And the key point here is that preliminary reports are intentionally limited. They're often called factual reports because that's their purpose, to establish the known facts surrounding an accident, not to determine why it happened. That comes with the final report, sometimes years later, after investigators have finished reviewing all of the evidence, the wreckage, witness interviews, avionics data, maintenance records, radar and ATC recordings. Everything investigators need to understand the sequence of events. In any case, the argument that once this crew lost GPS navigation, they were effectively left with obsolete technology that ultimately led them to becoming disorientated and flying into terrain, frankly doesn't reflect how instrument flying works. Now, don't get me wrong, as an airline pilot, I can tell you that GPS has revolutionized aviation over the past few decades. Modern GPS-based RNAV approaches are incredibly accurate and reduce pilot workload, but this doesn't mean that they replace other forms of navigation, especially for pilots flying relatively smaller and older aircraft like this 1979 King Air, and who don't always have the luxury of flying in high altitude airways for hours at a time. Ultimately, instrument-rated pilots are trained to navigate without GPS, using conventional radio aids and to set up for both precision approach instrument landing systems as well as non-precision approaches such as VOR and NDB approaches. Those skills are not optional, they form a core part of every instrument rating and are regularly demonstrated during recurrent training and proficiency checks. If a pilot today is properly trained and tested, then losing satellite navigation would be considered an abnormal situation for sure, and most likely a nuisance, but certainly not an unrecoverable emergency. In fact, this is something we experience here regularly when flying around Eastern Europe or close to the Middle East. And in this case, when the crew reported losing GPS, they immediately switched from the airport's GPS approach to an ILS and asked Albuquerque Center to provide radar vectors, which is exactly what you'd expect from an instrument-rated crew. You see, an ILS doesn't use satellite navigation in any way. Instead, it uses ground-based radio transmitters to guide the aircraft to the runway, and air traffic controllers can use radar to place an aircraft safely onto the beginning of the approach. And the instrument landing system has been the standard way of flying instrument approaches for decades before GPS arrived, and it's still really the standard today. I fly significantly more ILS approaches than any other type of approach. So, up to this point in the story, everything was fine. The crew had encountered a problem, they'd adapted to it, and were working with air traffic control towards a safe arrival. Nothing in the preliminary report suggests that the situation was escalating to something worse, which is precisely why the next decision becomes so important. You see, the question that the preliminary report leaves unanswered is why that plan to do an ILS was never completed. Because despite already being vectored towards an ILS that required no GPS whatsoever, the crew ultimately abandoned it and elected to continue visually instead. But why might a crew have made that decision? Now, it's not unusual for pilots to get cleared for a visual approach once they're within sight of the runway. In fact, in many airports in the world, including the United States, pilots are often cleared for a visual approach as soon as they state that they have the runway in sight. But these pilots were still 31 miles away from the airport when they said that they had a visual on Ruidoso, and they weren't aligned with the runway or even on a heading towards the airport. They were still heading north with the airport roughly at their 8 o'clock. So it would be easy to conclude that the key mistake here was the fact that this crew abandoned the ILS. The pilots didn't realise that turning towards the airport from that position would place the Capitan Mountains between them and the airport, so they simply should have stuck with their plan to fly an ILS. But as always, it's not that simple. Because there's another fact that was identified in the NTSB's preliminary report that got very little attention in those media articles. Another NOTAM that was very relevant to this flight alongside the note about GPS jamming. This NOTAM stated that Sierra Blanca Regional Airport's Automated Weather Observing System, or AWOS, was out of service. And at first glance, that might not sound particularly important. After all, the weather was clear, visibility was excellent, and the crew wasn't expecting to fly through clouds. But the AWOS doesn't simply tell pilots whether it's raining or not. It also provides the airport's official local altimeter setting, which is the barometric pressure that pilots use to calibrate their altimeters before flying an instrument approach. And that matters because every published instrument approach is designed around obstacle clearance, and that obstacle clearance is referenced to sea level pressure. If an aircraft's altimeter is even a few hectopascals in error, those carefully calculated safety margins begin to disappear. For that reason, both the RNAV approach that the crew was originally requesting and the ILS approach they later selected contain exactly the same note. When local altimeter setting not received, procedure not authorised. The NTSB also notes that the for-flight briefing that this crew had at their disposal didn't include a meteorological aerodrome report, or METAR, for their destination. Now, I want to be careful not to overstate the importance of that note, because the NTSB doesn't tell us whether the crew obtained a local altimeter setting from another source before beginning the approach. They may very well have done so, and investigators may ultimately conclude that the AWOS outage had no bearing on the accident whatsoever. But that's precisely the point. We simply don't know. But the point is that without an altimeter setting, both of the crew's options for an instrument approach at their destination go away, and their decision making gets more complicated than many of the headlines would suggest. And this would have been the case with or without GPS jamming. By this point, the crew had already dealt with the loss of satellite navigation. They may have been questioning the availability of published instrument approaches, and they were now approaching an airport surrounded by mountainous terrain on a completely moonless night. Which brings us back to the crew's decision to go visual, and more specifically, the fact that they reported having a visual on Rio Doso and asked to continue visually. And that wording is worth paying attention to because the preliminary report doesn't say if the pilots actually had the runway in sight or even the airport itself. It only mentions Rio Doso, a town that's a few miles away from the airport. Now, on a clear night from more than 30 miles away, it's entirely plausible that these pilots would see the lights of a small town, especially in an area with no other light sources around. And it's also plausible that they might have made out the lights of a runway at that distance, although runway 24 at Sierra Blanca doesn't have the elaborate approach lighting that we often see at bigger airports. This is yet another example of what we still don't know. And it's worth pointing out here that self-positioning your aircraft for a visual approach at night below the minimum safe altitude is risky and is often prohibited by airline SOPs. But there is one final question that I think deserves mentioning because, once again, it's almost entirely absent from the reporting. If GPS interference really did play a role in the final moments of this flight, it may not have been because the pilots couldn't navigate. It may have been because of what it did to the aircraft's terrain awareness systems. Now, the NTSB doesn't mention if the aircraft had a terrain awareness system like EGPWS on board. This aircraft was made in 1979 and a 2022 equipment listing for it doesn't mention the presence of such a system. Although even a plane like a King Air could be required to have a terrain awareness system depending on its seating configuration. And that's important because EGPWS relies on GPS to cross-reference the aircraft's position against a global terrain database. So if the aircraft was equipped with a GPS-dependent terrain awareness system, then it's possible that the resumed jamming during the visual approach could have degraded or disabled its forward-looking terrain warnings at precisely the worst moment. But given that the pilots reported being visual on a clear, cloudless night, is it fair to blame GPS jamming for what happened? To give you another example, in December 2024, Azerbaijan Airlines Flight 8243, an Embraer E190 with 67 people on board, was trying to land at Grozny International Airport in Russia, but couldn't because of GPS jamming in the region. Ukrainian drones were reportedly targeting Russian infrastructure in the area, which was the reason for the GPS jamming. And then, at least one surface-to-air missile hit the Embraer, which then diverted to Aktau in Kazakhstan and crashed near the airport with the loss of 38 people, including the pilots and a cabin crew member. That tragedy unquestionably involved GPS jamming, as did the accident that we're examining today. But is jamming the predominant factor for either of them? And that's really why we wanted to make this video. GPS jamming and spoofing are genuine and growing threats to aviation, and they're affecting aircraft in ways that aren't always obvious, which is why we're coming back to this again and again. But here the problem is that some news sources are eager to draw parallels between this event and another incident near El Paso Airport near the US-Mexican border, where a military anti-drone weapon was put to use with little warning and triggered an airspace closure. But as I've explained, that's not what happened here. The military didn't secretly blanket the area around White Sands with interference. The exercise had been published in advance and was even suspended when air traffic control requested it. The crew weren't suddenly left without any form of navigation. They immediately transitioned to a conventional approach that generations of instrument pilots have flown safely long before GPS was a thing. And before we can honestly say what role GPS jamming ultimately played, investigators still need to answer fundamental questions about the available approaches, the decision to continue visually, what that crew actually saw and when, and whether any terrain warning systems were functioning as intended. Until those questions are answered, I think it's simply too early to reduce this tragedy to a single lost GPS signal. That may make for compelling headlines, but it doesn't reflect what happened, and for that, we need to wait for the NTSB's verdict. My name's Ben Watts, you're watching Mentor Now. Have an amazing week, and I will see you next time.